Zeke's ideology was always based in a kind of depression, a persisting mindset that life was nothing but suffering and that it would have been better if he had never been born. He extends this line of logic to the rest of his people to create his plan to sterilize the Eldians, and though it's still awful, out of the proposed plans in the show, it certainly feels better than the punitive mass genocide supported by other characters, and even seems kind of respectable due to the fact that the Eldians really do experience a disproportionate amount of suffering, and his wish that they could all die off slowly, peacefully, without violence, without bringing harm to anyone. However, he tries to make a case for all Eldians when he's really only basing his goals off of his own hopelessness developed not just through the common prejudice and oppression faced by all Eldians in Marley, but also the trauma and lack of love received from his father. Not every Eldian wishes they were never born, that is you. His depressive mindset is what leads him down a different path from Eren. While Eren's hopelessness turns into an incredibly destructive rage, Zeke's hopelessness only pulls him deeper into despair, wishing to escape the current situation instead of change it, and his plan was destined to never work out. Zeke found himself forced to work towards his goal under the nose of the Marleyan military dictatorship, and thus had to hide his true intentions and feelings from everyone around him for years. And then when he finally got in contact with someone who he thought not only actually shared his perspective and goals, but also came from the same father and probably shared some of the same traumatic experiences which shaped him, it turned out that that person had actually been lying, was just planning on using him the entire time, and had a much more loving upbringing with the same father. This betrayal then results in Zeke being imprisoned and used as a tool for super ultra mega genocide, very contrary to his desire to achieve peace with minimal violence. Out of all of the major characters in Attack on Titan, Zeke is definitely the one who gets the most screwed over and ends up the least successful in achieving his goals. Despite me disagreeing with his ultimate motivations, he ends up being the character I feel the most sorry for, and this was only cemented by 10 minutes of the final part of the whole series, a scene I was not expecting at all, which ended up becoming one of my favorites in all of Attack on Titan. If life is just suffering, then what is the point of being alive? Well, first, what is life? For most of time, there was nothing but inanimate matter, rocks, and probably some other stuff being pushed around and colliding with each other, driven solely by natural forces. Eventually, though, something came into existence with the ability to replicate itself, and it was able to avoid being destroyed long enough to do so. At a baseline level, life can be traced back to exactly this, matter gaining the ability to reproduce. At least, that's basically the theory Zeke has, and it makes sense to me. But then, he tries to use this to answer a different question. He looks back at all the shit he has had to go through, all the suffering he and the people around him have experienced, and asks, what is the point of enduring this suffering? Also, what drives people to inflict such suffering on others in the first place? And the answer he comes to seems to be to survive so that we can reproduce. And this sucks for him. Like, the point of all of this violence and devastation is just to bring more people into this terrible world so that they can also experience the violence and devastation? That sucks. We should all just die. I think we can easily run into trouble when we try to define the meaning of our lives. It is good to think about what the overarching goal of our lives should be, but if the answer we come to is something we don't actually want to achieve, that's gonna make life as a whole seem pretty pointless. I know my own lowest point came one fall semester of high school when I didn't even know what I wanted to do with my life, let alone what the meaning of it should be. And with the future getting closer, I felt this increasing pressure that there was no purpose to anything I was doing. Zeke found no value in his hypothesized purpose of life, and at first this actually gave him a drive. His euthanasia plan, his life's work, was primarily about preventing the suffering of future children by making them never exist. But now, after facing utter failure, he digs himself deeper into the feeling of hopelessness and pointlessness which was already the basis of his worldview, so much so that he becomes apathetic towards death, saying that it might even be better than living as you'll be free from pain and fear and taxes and all the stuff you have to worry about when you're alive. I want to talk for a minute about depression. When I use this term, I refer not to its most extreme form, which often requires medication to treat, but the broader category. Depression is not just a chemical imbalance in the brain, but also deeply connected to your thoughts. It both affects and is affected by the way you think about certain things. Constantly telling yourself that life sucks and is terrible will not make you feel better about living. In fact, it will make it demonstrably worse. You will feel worse worse, thus prompting your brain to think even more about how shitty being alive is. That is a very simplified version of one way in which depression is a self-perpetuating cycle, but I think it should be taken as a useful concept for everyone. All of us are affected by how we think about ourselves and the world we live in, and we have the ability to influence our emotional well-being with our thoughts. This is not me saying that people should just think happy thoughts and depression will never exist again. I just want to acknowledge the fact that our thoughts matter. If this was not true, therapy would not be a thing. And this concept is clearly shown with Zeke. His euthanasia plan is based on him projecting his own desire to have never been born onto the rest of the Eldians. That desire to never be born originates from the prejudice he faced as an Eldian, as well as the lack of expressed love he felt from his father, but I think it's pretty clear that it's also largely developed by this self-perpetuating spiral of despair. Zeke keeps telling himself that life is suffering and that there is no escape other than death, and because of that, he never figures out a way to be happy or work towards fulfillment, and his only goal is to escape into death. Zeke doesn't just accept the world as it is, he wants to do something to affect change, which I think is good, but he just has a different kind of philosophical depression, one that leads him to something that is very much not the solution to the problems which exist, one that makes him feel even worse about life, and it results in his conclusion that to escape the cycle of fear and hatred, to escape suffering, the solution is not to solve problems and make life better, but to escape life itself. He never even considers that maybe not all of life is suffering, and this all leads him to the paths, where he faces the worst possible punishment for himself, a place where death does not exist. In the paths, Zeke finds himself trapped in an exaggerated version of his own worldview. To him, life is nothing more than inert matter which can reproduce, and so he finds himself in a world of nothing but inanimate sand. Clearly, he is out of place. He is not sand, and so he is very fucking bored and like almost brain dead by the time Armin gets to him. He sees himself as the kind of matter which is supposed to want to survive and replicate, but he doesn't want to replicate, and he's been pushed to ask himself, why am I not just sand? Why do I have to be alive? But then, luckily for him, Armin pulls a thing out of the ground. They both wonder, why is this thing here in this world filled with sand? If we are supposed to be nothing more than matter which wants to reproduce, why is there something that exists which doesn't contribute to that goal? Something that isn't just sand? The answer is that humans are not sand, and we are not just sand that wants to multiply either. We have desires that go beyond the basic biological instinct to have children, and what Armin found in the sand was the embodiment of that. Think for a second about robots. Robots are coded with a purpose. Build this car for me. Write pretty piano music. Do not kill people. And they appear more human when they do things that seem to go against their purpose or aren't necessary for achieving the goal of their code. But the thing is, humans were not coded with any one action we were all meant to do. There is no code that we contrast ourselves with in order to determine how human we appear to be. We just do shit. Reproducing might make sense as our purpose in terms of like evolution and natural selection, yes, but we don't choose every single action every day of our lives based on what will get us children the fastest. At least, I hope most people don't do that. Maybe I can't speak for everyone. I personally don't weigh in sex maximization with every choice I make. I am a normal person that thinks about how the consequences of my action might eventually lead to producing some sort of good feeling emotion for myself. I think that's what normal people do. And sometimes we find leaves in the sand. I really love the way Armin describes this memory with his best friends and other memories which he associates the same feeling with. He says that he felt like the entire reason he had been born was to experience this moment, aka it was the purpose of being alive. Zeke spent untold years messing around in the sand which was completely meaningless to him, but in that same sand, Armin was able to find an object which feels important to him, something associated with the feeling that your reason for living was that moment, something that is different for different people, a leaf or a baseball. That's right, what Armin actually pulled out of the sand was the fucking meaning of life, the true meaning of life, not some arbitrary singular goal that a lot of people might not care about, but to experience those moments which actually make you feel joy, happiness, fulfillment, moments which do nothing but force you to feel like you were born to experience them. These moments which mean nothing if you think the purpose of life is to replicate or amass wealth or gain power, but mean everything if you know that we are meant to find our own happiness, whether it be a leaf or a baseball. Zeke thought his life was nothing but a struggle amongst constant suffering, and that the most significant thing he could do would be to prevent all that for as many potential Eldian children as possible by fixing what he believed was the biggest mistake of his whole life, deciding to be born. But this mindset buried something much more important, a momentary feeling of a little bit of happiness while playing catch with his mentor, throwing the baseball back and forth, feeling like he could do that same thing forever. Zeke doesn't make a complete turnaround and realize everything he did ever was for the wrong reasons, but he does admit that at least 2 of his ideas were wrong. He tells his mentor, Mr. Cathedrale, if it meant I could play catch with you, I wouldn't mind being born again. He's recognizing that the purpose of life didn't have to be continuing the species. Instead, all this time, it could have been chasing after the feeling that throwing the baseball gave him. And then he turns to his father and thanks him for being born, for giving him the chance to have that experience. Despite everything he went through, he no longer believes that being born was a mistake. Zeke comments on the weather like first thing after escaping from the paths, and that's important to me. After calling Levi to come kill him, of course, Zeke gets a moment to see the world with new eyes. He looks out on this landscape that's frankly kind of desolate, but there's a clear sky, and he thinks to himself how lovely the weather is, and that he wished he could have seen it sooner. I think that if you don't ever think of life as beautiful, if you never find yourself suddenly having this feeling come to you that like the world is wonderful and you're so glad to be in it, that's like a bad sign or something. Speaking based on literally nothing but my own life, I'm not a psychologist, please don't take that too seriously. But like so many people have not felt something as simple as genuinely feeling that the weather is nice, and it's not just because they live in the UK. A lot of people are blocked off from what should be simple pleasures as a result of distraction from the pursuit of fulfillment and happiness by being led to a goal that doesn't best suit them, or just not knowing what their goal should be. That can be caused by the bad conditions they live under, but also just the way they think about the world. Speaking from experience, I think everyone can benefit from starting to see life not as something to struggle through or escape, but as something you can enjoy and make better for yourself. You can't be forced out of depression, despair, listlessness, and there's not always an Armin near you to pull the meaning of life out of the ground while you have a therapy session in a God's pocket dimension. First and foremost, it's something one needs to decide for themselves, to figure out and change the ways you think about yourself and the world, and to open yourself up to the fact that life can be great. Weirdly, that shift to feeling good about being alive might feel so great that you feel you'd be satisfied and happy dying at just that moment. I'd like to think that for the first time since playing catch with his mentor, that's how Zeke felt in his final few seconds. Because I remember going on a bike ride during the quarantine, during the year that made me change the way I thought about the world and discovered an actual purpose. I remember biking past the baseball fields by the lake and under the trees, getting a feeling that the world around me really was beautiful, realizing that I enjoyed being alive and that I was happy to be here experiencing that moment. I was never depressed, but this was the first time I had felt those exact things. For the first time that I could remember, I thought to myself that the weather was really nice. I remember feeling happy. I remember feeling satisfied. I remember feeling like I would be fine dying right then. I hope that when the time comes for me to leave this world, I'll feel the same way. And I hope everyone watching can understand that feeling, whether it be now or however long it takes. I wish you leaves and baseballs.